Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 683, interview number 3 with Elizebeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. This program is being recorded on August 2nd of the year 2009. And once again, it is my privilege and pleasure to bring back to our airwaves Paul Fitzgerald and Elizebeth Gould, the authors of the consummately important recent book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published in softcover by City Lights Books. Elizebeth and Paul, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Well, thank you, Dave, for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
Continuing with the perhaps heavy-handed metaphor that I've used in the past about your book, describing it as a literary cluster bomb, not a literary bombshell or blockbuster, but a literary cluster bomb, I'd like to kick off this portion of our hours-long discussion about the book by reading a very stunning quote. And I want to stress for the listeners that, in a sense, this is kind of like when they sit in Starbucks and they bring around a little piece of a fresh banana frappuccino for you to taste. So this will give you a little sampling of the actual flavors between the covers, so to speak. And I'd like to use this as a jumping off point. On pages 294 and 295, you write about the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, a fellow named Craig Murray, and his description of, I guess one could say, the Afghani political and commercial landscape. And it's really quite stunning, and I'd like to sort of use this as a yardstick. And then over the course of the next hour, I'd like to explore how did we get to this point from where we started. And obviously, some review of what we've talked about in the past and some review of what went before this, obviously, will be mandated. On page 294, you write, a July 2007 article in the Daily Mail by Britain's former ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, explained how the West's short-sighted favoritism for Northern Alliance warlords acts against the war's stated objective of rooting out terror, instead turning Afghanistan from a mere grower of opium into the biggest heroin exporter in the world. Quote, Afghanistan, has succeeded in what our international aid efforts urge every developing country to do. Afghanistan has gone into manufacturing and value-added operations. It now exports not opium, but heroin. Opium is converted into heroin on an industrial scale, not in kitchens, but in factories. Millions of the gallons of the chemicals needed for this process are shipped into Afghanistan by tanker. The tankers and bulk opium lorries on the way to factories share roads improved by American aid with NATO troops, unquote. How could this have happened on this scale, Murray asked. The answer is simple. The four largest players in the heroin business are all senior members of the Afghan government. The government that our soldiers are fighting and dying to protect, unquote. Murray's testimony might seem like a contradiction given Britain and America's much publicized efforts to destroy Afghanistan's opium crop, but a careful look at the operation reveals that the program targets largely Pashtun farmers in the south near Kandahar, stoking the flames of Pashtun anger, while inadvertently protecting northern warlords like General Rashid Dostum, who, as head of the Afghan armed forces, operates around the interdiction without interference. Murray writes, Dostum is an Uzbek, and heroin passes over the Friendship Bridge from Afghanistan to Uzbekistan, where it is taken over by President Islam Karimov's people. It is then shipped up the railway line in bales of cotton to St. Petersburg and Riga. The heroin jeeps run from General Dostum to President Karimov. The UK, United States, and Germany have all invested large sums in donating the most sophisticated detection and screening equipment to the Uzbek Customs Center at Termez to stop the heroin from coming through. But the convoys of jeeps running between Dostum and Karimov are simply waved around the side of the facility, unquote. That is not exactly, I think, what most of the people who designed this particular operation had in mind. So, again, sort of as the theme of the program and as the vehicle for expose, how did we get to this appalling state of affairs from where we were?
Well, you know, the issue, Dave, is that the situation today is much further along than anyone realizes. And it was established, of course, during the Secret War, beginning in the 1970s, 1973, When the Marxists took over in 1978 in Afghanistan, the secret war intensified, and that just kind of that provided a kind of carte blanche. And a lot of the international groups, I mean, the French were very much involved in this, the French intelligence service, and Alexandre de Moranche, I believe we spoke about this in the last program a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the French were known to support their covert operations in Indochina with, back in the 1950s, in the 40s and the 1950s, with the opium trade. That was very much an aspect of that, and that was very well known amongst the intelligence community and outside the intelligence community. But that sort of thing really had been, the United States really wasn't implicated at that point. The United States is the latecomer to this process, and certainly the darker side of this process. And so as the United States grew in importance in these areas, in Southeast Asia and South Central Asia, in these prime opium growing areas in the 1950s and 60s, the United States began to develop ways in which it involved itself in this. And at first, there were some people who were involved directly with the agency, and as a result of that, it became an embarrassment. You remember the church hearings back in the 1970s, where all these dirty things that were going on were attributed to CIA covert actions. So what happened at the time was a lot of these things began to become privatized, and the Afghan war was a perfect example of the mating of a lot of these different interests in the Middle East and in Europe and in the United States to try to finance this covert war through Pakistan's ISI and the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the BCCI, which was established by a Pakistani businessman. And so I'll read you from a book called The Outlaw Bank, just to give you an idea of, this is a book that was written a few years ago by Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwynn. We quote it in the book. Thus, the undertaking in Pakistan was planned as a hands-off operation for the CIA. Day-by-day contact with the Mujahideen would be left to the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. The United States could then deny any involvement. The CIA could supply the weapons and the money, weapons purchased from the third world countries, so they would not appear to have come from America, and untraceable cash money. Arrangements were also struck with China and Saudi Arabia. China agreed to sell the Mujahideen arms, and Saudi Arabia was to match U.S. financial contributions and send the funds through clandestine channels to the CIA, to the ISI, not the CIA. So this is the way it was set up originally. It was off the books. Now, if you ask people today at the CIA what was going on, they said, well, of course, we had no direct involvement with it, but we did know there was a drug problem. Milt Bearden, who ran the CIA operation in the 1980s from Pakistan, 1984 on, has admitted on camera that they were well aware that the drugs were going on. He said, but it wasn't really their mission to deal with that. I mean, that's their way of dealing with it. Jack Blum, who was the special counsel to the Kerry Committee investigating the narcotics in 1987, stated at one point that 12 metric tons were seized off the Makhroom coast of Pakistan in 1987, 1988. That's the world supply for a year. Okay, now that was 22 years ago. They were putting out, this particular secret war was putting out that kind of amount of drugs. And what we're doing is, I mean, I just picked up the newspaper the other day here in Boston, and they've got two articles that were not related, but in the same newspaper. One was about the pure heroin that is coming into the city of Boston at this point. It's so pure that it can be snorted. It doesn't have to be injected. And the other thing was about the Kalashnikovs. Every time gangs are busted in Boston now, the police are picking up scores of rounds, thousands of rounds of ammunition and Kalashnikovs, which have been imported, it said, from China and from Eastern Europe. So, the war has come home, and it's, as I said, it's a lot further along than anyone realizes.
Elizabeth, some of the things that we talked about last time might be worth, I think, bringing up in terms of approaching how we got to that state of affairs where basically the Afghan government and 4 senior officials of that government are acting as executives in industrial-style heroin production. Between the Soviet withdrawal and the events of September 11th and the U.S. Invasion into Afghanistan, you talked about the fossil fuels industry and various corporate interests that were sort of dining out on the United States. Why don't we recoup a little bit of that and then discuss Pakistan and the events of September 11th and how some of this actually led or overlaps those specific events, which of course triggered the U.S. invasion?
Well, I think that we really have to look at the entire events in Afghanistan really in light of a historical perspective. I mean, when you really do look at the way in which the drug trade really has been shown to wind itself through every one of these eras, epics, that we are really looking at a process that really, to end up with an Afghan government that basically is facilitating the largest, expansion of drug trade in Afghanistan, really should not be a surprise. That there was no way that anyone was going to be allowed to, take the political power for Afghanistan. Remember, back in 2001, when the Bonn conference took place, Hamid Karzai was really handpicked by the United States. And that, in fact, the warlords, like Dostum, were basically being invited right into the government. And that, so all the preconditions that really needed to be set up to guarantee that Karzai's government was going to facilitate this enhancement of the drug trade was inevitable. So I see this is one of the issues that concerns me about the way in which Karzai's government, which really, they talk about, a puppet. I mean, there is no way that the Karzai government could have ended up in any other situation when it came to the drug relationship. So this is part of the reason that we have to begin to look at these deep roots and understand that the kind of play. Now, when you do bring in Pakistan and you do bring in the agenda that Pakistan also had, I thought that this might be a quote that might help to establish how long ago, when we went out of our way to basically give President Zia the full power to determine who was going to get all the financing that was coming in through weapons and training and through Saudi Arabia, through the United States into Pakistan. This would have been back, in the 1980s. This was Selig Harrison, who's actually, he was he was a Washington Post correspondent. He was also one of the preeminent South Asia experts. And he's been on this issue, certainly in the Pakistan issue and the Afghan issue going way back, and he's spoken with many of the key players. And one of the people he interviewed was General Zia. And this is a quote that Selig Harrison made about his conversation. General Zia spoke to me about expanding Pakistan's sphere of influence to control Afghanistan, then Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and then Iran and Turkey, Harrison said. The design continues, he said. General Mohammad Aziz, who was involved in that Zia plan, has been elevated now to a key position by Chief Executive General Pervez Musharraf. So you see the handover that we're talking about in terms of the pan-Islamist movement, in terms of the deeper agendas that the United States through Zia was really signing on to. And again, the drugs really becomes the financial facilitator of this process. So we really have to begin to look at, the very tragic reality that foreign policy really is not what the front page of the news is telling us at all, that it really has more to do with these kinds of movements which are using obviously the cover of things like, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It was the greatest threat to peace since World War II, and we have to do something about it. What that inaugurated was a whole host of activities that really were inevitably going to be financed by the drug trade. And when you bring that up to 2001 and you look at the individuals that the United States really forced on the new Afghan government, the warlords like Dostum, who were it was a fait accompli. That part of what was going to be activated in that kind of configuration was the drug trade. And now we're looking at, of course, the fact that the Taliban, and again, when we have to remember the Taliban and its origins going back to Pakistani intelligence, with the idea of creating a Pakistani-friendly government in Afghanistan, is one of the major beneficiaries of the drug trade. So you're beginning, I think we're beginning to see that these are inevitable tie-ins.
I mean, as Liz mentioned, during the rule of Zia-ul Haq in the 1980s, when he agreed to this arrangement with the U.S. and the CIA, he set up Governor Fazl Haq of the Northwest Frontier Province to run this drug operation, and they created a trucking company known as the Logistics Cell to move the arms in and the drugs out. And a lot of this was going on during that time period, and it was reported in other media around the world. It was reported in Britain, it was reported in Canada, but we never got any of this story. In fact, at one point, we tried to, I stood up, we gave an event in 1981, in the fall of 1981 in Boston, at a local hotel here, which was attended by a number of local and national media and international media. And the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, who was then at the Tufts Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. This was after our first trip, and we were presenting some of a look in terms of what was actually going on inside Afghanistan. He stood up and said, "Who gave you permission to say this? Who gave you permission to do this?" And I told him, I said, I didn't realize as an American citizen I needed permission to do that sort of thing. There's no prohibition of going to Afghanistan. And he said, "Well, you're treading very closely to the line of a Soviet propagandist." So, I mean, this was the way, and there was a chill in the room at that point. Now, this was a man who had been on McNeil Lira 2 or 3 days after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan with Richard Pipes, who had been the leader of Team B. The two of them had sat there and they'd said, "Oh, the Soviets are invading Afghanistan because they're getting ready to conquer Europe and the Persian Gulf." Okay, this was the official line, and what we were doing from the very beginning was trying to crack that official line, and boy, they were putting out the word very, very clearly that if you were going to cross that line and start saying what was really going on in Afghanistan, we're going to start calling you names. And so, so that was the chill that was put on the American media, and so as a result of that, I think a lot of what happened in the 1980s and why the story never got out about the drugs, about our relationship with Pakistan, about Pakistan, the development of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, about the support of terrorism in that part of the world. I mean, we're basically doing today what the Soviets were trying to do in 1979 and 1980, was to roll back terrorism in South Central Asia. And so none of that story ever got across to the American public. So it's very difficult today for our leaders, especially Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was instrumental in creating this particular paradigm in 1978 and 1979 at the National Security Council as American policy, which would be followed by the Reagan administration and expanded upon by the Reagan administration. It's very difficult for them to explain to the United States public, as you said, how did we get in this? What are we doing there? What is happening? The situation, of course, was so far off the rails to begin with that now what's happened is it's taken on a life of its own, and the United States and I don't believe any of the major powers at this point really have a complete control over what's going to happen.
Elizabeth, I'd like to linger just a moment on the passage that you read, quoting Selig Harrison. I wonder if I could prevail on you to reread just the few sentences in which the scope of projected Pakistani power into Asia is described, specifically the areas in which they are looking to project their direct influence.
The sphere of influence to control Afghanistan, then Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and then Iran and Turkey.
It's quite something. I can't imagine people in Berkeley demonstrating against Pakistani imperialism, yet when one contemplates that projected strategy, it is almost like a mirror image of what Team B was presenting as the Soviets' goal, in which, to an extent, Paul just re-articulated, namely the drive to the Persian Gulf with the distorted intelligence and so forth. One of the many strong points of your book is that it brings out, I think, things that even the average well-informed American simply is not, of which they are not cognizant. And again, the extent to which the way policy is unfolding there is, in certain respects, a manifestation of Pakistani imperial designs.
Well, I think you really have to put it, though, in perspective. I mean, remember, Zia ended up assassinated. So whatever his design was, his role ended rather abruptly. So he served a purpose, and then he was gone. Maybe his fate was sealed when he was so bold to boast about these things publicly. So I think that when you look at these mid-level players like like Saddam Hussein and Noriega and Zia, I think you have to realize that that sometimes they get a little too their ego takes over. But that's what's so interesting about Zbigniew Brzezinski, because here is a man who has actually publicly boasted about the fact that he drew the Soviets into Afghanistan with the intent of holding them there, and he's never paid a political price for that at all. So it is kind of interesting to see how some of them seem to vanish.
I mean, I would say, you certainly can't look at the situation as a black and white situation. You can't look at it monolithically.
Sure.
I think that, and that's the secret, and that's what we're trying to do with our book. It's almost, our book is like an instruction manual for how to look at these things with a different point of view. Maybe pull back a little bit further. I mean, in the 1980s, let's say that the Mujahideen and the Muslim extremists were being used as the tool of French intelligence, British intelligence, and American intelligence in order to undermine the control of the Soviet Union in that part of the world. So let's say at that point in time, in the 1980s, the relationship was 80-20. It was 80%, we gave them the satellite photos, we gave them the weapons, we arranged the weapons deals, we provided the technology, we gave them the Stinger missiles, we provided them with the with the Hercules airlifters to lift those Kalashnikovs out of Egypt and bring them to Peshawar to make it look as if they were Russians who, they were Afghan soldiers who had defected, that sort of thing, okay? So let's say it was any 80-20. Well, now, because of the world situation, because of the weakness of the Western financial situation, both in Europe and the United States, because of the economic crisis, and the fact that, the United States pays paper money for real oil, and the Saudis and those people in the Middle East who sit on top of that stuff, and those people in South Central Asia and the Caspian Basin who sit on that stuff, they really have real commodities, which we're trying to still convince, our governments are still trying to convince them to take paper money for. So let's say the influence now isn't 80-20 any longer. Maybe the influence is 65%, okay? We're still maybe over the 50% mark in terms of our influence on these people, but as the technology changes and technologies become more available, the computer technology and the development of industries in China and India and around the world, we don't have the weight we had even 30 years ago.
I also think we really need to keep in mind the historical underpinnings of the kind of movements that originally brought the British Empire to the region was really eventually expressed by Halford Mackinder, as the control of this region really was considered to be key, and keeping the Russian Empire at bay was key. And then we go into the 20th century and we see literally a replay of the same dynamics that really drove the British Empire to its relationship with Afghanistan. But what's so interesting is the fact that the British Empire was never able to really subjugate Afghanistan, even though it left it in a condition that eventually did produce a crisis within the country. It's still a very different crisis than if Afghanistan had actually been colonized by the British Empire. So what we're looking at today really is this sort of final act of this play of this idea that Mackinder had stirred and that is still being used. Here we are at the end of, we're at the beginning of the 21st century, and we're now still living with an idea about how to control the world by controlling Eurasia. And certainly Zbigniew Brzezinski is a big advocate of that idea and has gone, into obviously at this point, many decades of political influence to try to guarantee that control, and especially to keep the Russians out of having any influence on the region. So, and if you look at obviously the oil interests and other natural resource interests that are all at play there, and then the drugs become simply a part of the economy. This is really what the drugs have become.
Right. And there's another aspect to this too, and that is, the U.S. support here for what used to be called the War on Terror I mean, what's interesting is that the Pakistanis have requested that they be given the same kind of high-tech tools the United States has been using, the Predator drones and the satellite information, so that they can target their own terrorists. Well, this is where it gets very dicey for the United States, because Pakistan was established as a kind of military base after World War II. Jinnah who was the president of the first president and the founding father of Pakistan, he made a deal with the British that he would allow presence of Western military bases in Pakistan following the war. And so, as a beginning, the Punjabi military were pretty much the people who ran Pakistan, who were the ruling elite in Pakistan, and they've been the ones who've been suppressing all these other, not necessarily minority, but other ethnic groups within the state of Pakistan. This happened, of course, with the issue over Bangladesh. It was another nationality. They wanted to pull away from this Punjabi-controlled state. And so this has also been going on with this so-called war on terror. The Punjabi military in Pakistan, which runs the country, has been targeting Baluch nationalists and Pashtun nationalists. And it has suddenly, over a period of 7 or 8 years, transformed from a war on so-called terror to a war on Baluch and Pashtun nationalists. And this is becoming more and more evident. And this is a self-defeating process for the United States, because to Pashtun and Baluchi nationalists, the United States is now seen as supporting a Punjabi military.
And then when you can add the Taliban confusion to that, you end up really with a very dangerous situation, especially for Afghanistan.
So the U.S. policy has enabled the Taliban to pose as the champion of both Islam and of Pashtun nationalism. And this is completely self-defeating for the United States. Add to the fact that based on present counterterrorism doctrine, counterinsurgency doctrine, you'd have to have somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 troops inside that area in order to pacify that population. And that's just not going to happen. The money isn't there to do that. The Europeans don't have those kind of numbers of troops, and neither do the United States.
In fact, we actually have heard from a number of Afghans that if the United States actually simply stopped financing Pakistan, then a lot of the problems in the region would be resolved in a regional way. That the problem is this hyper military, advantage that Pakistan has been given by the United States to basically dominate the way in which the region is handled. And Pakistan really has had an obsession, really, about its what appears to be the eventual war with India, and everything has been driven through that window.
So you see, during the Cold War, this is exactly what Pakistan would do. Whenever with these nationalist groups, these Pashtun nationalist groups, or Sindhi nationalist groups, or Baluchi nationalist groups, would start an uprising, Pakistan would get on the telephone, call Washington, and blame it on the communists. They'd blame it on the Soviet Union. Now what's happening is they can't blame it on the Soviet Union any longer, so they say, well, that's an Al-Qaeda guy who's doing that down there. So you give us the satellite pictures and the drones, and we'll go down there and we'll kill those guys, okay? We don't know, and the fact is that probably in many cases the United States is aligning itself with an extermination campaign that is being projected by the Punjabi military on its enemies.
But it does really fit the whole idea of the Mackinder idea that clearly that this
Elizabeth,
has to be controlled.
Elizabeth, I'm just going to jump in here. We are almost out of time on this side. I'd like to have you promote your website and where people can obtain the book, and let's continue with the discussion of the tribes and Pakistani intent towards same and how that's playing out. Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. Your website?
InvisibleHistory.com. You can go to citylights.com. You can get it there too. We have it right on the website. There's a link right to City Lights.
Very good. And we have been speaking with Elizebeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the authors of the consummately important recent book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, softcover edition, City Lights books. We'll be talking more with Paul and Elizabeth in Side 2, but this concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 683, interview number 3 with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. This program is being recorded on August 2nd of the year 2009. My name's Dave Emory for Paul and Elizabeth. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 683, interview number 3 with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizebeth Gould. This program is being recorded on August 2nd of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves Elizebeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the authors of the constantly important recent book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published in softcover by City Lights Books. Paul and Elizebeth, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
At the end of this side, remind me if I forget, but let's once again mention your website and where people can go to order this book. We were talking at the end of side 1 about Pakistan's and the Punjabi elites' policies towards tribes. And among the tribes we talked about were the Baluchis and the Pashtuns. I may not be conjugating Baluchi right, but who were the Pashtuns? You write extensively about the Pashtuns, Pashtunistan, how that dynamic has played out in Afghani history over really many, many decades, a couple of 100 years at least. Tell us more about the Pashtuns, because it's a name we've already encountered, and it's a name that anybody who's going to be looking at Afghanistan is going to run into, and yet they don't understand much about it. You explain much about it in your book.
Well, the Pashtuns consider themselves to be Afghans. They consider that the term Afghan applies to them, and that applies to a group of people who are ethnically Pashtun. They have their own language called Pashto, and they have been in that region of the world somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 years. The ancient city of Bactria, which was the ancient culture of Bactria, and the city of Balkh, as an example, that Alexander the Great attacked in the 4th millennium BC, was considered to be Pashtun tribal area. And what's interesting is that depending on who you talk to, whether it's the French archaeologists or the British archaeologists try to put and anthropologists try to play down Pashtun nationalism because it was such a burr, a thorn in their side with their 3 attempts to conquer this area called Pashtunistan. But the French actually looked at the situation, and they back in the 1930s, they did a lot of excavations up in the northern area of Afghanistan around Balkh, where Zoroaster was said to have come from. And they attributed that this was the origins of Pashtun culture were back in that time period. And I'll quote you from an article that's actually yesterday by Kathy Gannon in the Associated Press, Pashtun Ethnic Agenda at the Heart of Afghan War. If anything was timely, it's this article. It's an AP article. It said, it irks the Pashtuns that they, descendants of kings who have ruled from Iran to New Delhi, feel relegated to secondary citizen status by Tajiks and other tribes who led the resistance to the Taliban. They are eyed with suspicion by their non-Pashtun brethren and targeted by international forces. You have to look back, 500 years in order to understand what the Pashtuns really are about in the modern world. The first aspect of Pashtun nationalism came about in the 16th century. There was a mystical Sufi leader back in that time period, and his name was Pir Roshan, which means, that's a taken name. That means Saint Roshan. It means saint, the enlightened saint. He basically was a Pashtun who was very upset with the Mughal Empire and also with his own tribal rule, and decided that he was going to organize a group of people that were going to try to create a new kind of society. And he actually advocated for equality with women and for a kind of communalism that would share property and that would share the wealth of the nation. And so he is considered to be Bayezid Ansari was the man's name. He's considered to be the kind of the founder of modern Pashtun nationalism. And then what happened is that in 1747, Ahmad Shah Durrani, who was a member of the Durrani clan of Pashtuns, forged together a nation of what we think of today pretty much as Afghanistan. And he united the various tribes. He united the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Hazara and the Turkoman and the various other tribes, the myriad other tribes that inhabit this region, and pulled them together. But the center of the empire was Kabul and the Hindu Kush, and the area on the eastern side of the Hindu Kush which is known as the Indus Valley region. Now, the Indus Valley region, of course, is one of the oldest, most ancient civilizations in the world. They have really, because of there's been so many wars there going on since the 1940s and 50s and 60s, between the separation of Pakistan, the division of Pakistan, and the war in Afghanistan. They really haven't had a lot of opportunity. Archaeologists haven't had a lot of opportunity to get in there and actually investigate some of these ancient cities and their culture. But they do know it is classified as one of the 4 ancient cultures of the world. So this is the Pashtuns that we're dealing with. And of course, what happened is that in the 19th century, the British and the East India Company decided that this territory was very, very important to their empire. And there was a debate in the British Parliament between the Conservatives and the Liberals over what exactly was necessary to protect the British Empire. The Conservatives believed that they needed to control the cities of Herat and Kandahar, which were the gateways to India. And the Liberals believed that the Indus River was the legitimate boundary of their empire and their financial interests in that part of the world. So that was in the 19th century. And then in 1893...
Well, the Durand Line, the infamous Durand Line, was actually formed by Sir Mortimer Durand to really deal with the fact that it effectively was a capitulation by the British Empire, that they couldn't deal with the Pashtun nationalists, they couldn't deal with their power. So they basically did what I guess many empires have done. They divided to conquer. And in the result, of course, we're looking at, is the rest, as they say, is history. But I also wanted to point out, too, that, in terms of the experiences that many Europeans had in dealing with Afghanistan in the 19th century, that there were many experiences that indicated that there was really a very special kind of people forming. People hear about, that these people are very hospitable. They're warriors, but they're very hospitable. And that's part of their history, too. They were known for having accepted Westerners who came in, as Christians, and who were very respectful of the Christians that came in. They were very willing to coexist with other belief systems. In fact, it was actually East India Company political officer Alexander Burnes who advised the British Empire, this would have been in 1832, that this is a people, and this is actually the quote, "The people of this country are kind-hearted and hospitable. They have no prejudice against a Christian and none against our nation." And he advised that the British basically work with a strong Afghanistan, and that was their best way to really defend their interests in the region. And needless to say, we know that didn't happen. In fact, the British eventually prosecuted their first war against Afghanistan in 1839. So that began the descent effectively by not having taken the advice of obviously this very, this very informed political officer. They really signed their own, the end of their own empire effectively.
Well, they set the tone for their own, for their own defeat, and they were defeated on 3 separate occasions. Instead of making allies with the Afghans, they made them into enemies with whom they felt they needed to conquer. And then once they couldn't conquer them, then they took the position that, well, the Afghans really aren't a nation anyway. They're just a collection of tribes. Well, what's happened now is that they're still trying to claim that Afghanistan never really was a nation and is just a collection of tribes. The only problem is that the entire tribal culture has been destroyed by 30 years of warfare, 35 years of warfare at this point. And so what's happened is that the Malik, the leader of the tribe, has been replaced by the mullah. And the mullah, of course, is beholden not to the Afghan nation, he's not to Kabul. The mullah is beholden to Mecca. And that is what's been going on, more and more so, with the influence first of the West and now more and more of Middle Eastern influences that have come into this pan-Islamism.
But that actually was really triggered very much by the United States when the United States chose to basically really empower the Islamists in order to prosecute their war against the Soviet Union. What you were seeing was an imbalance was created in the region that was very unnatural for Afghanistan, that had always practiced a very moderate form of Islam. I mean, Afghanistan gave women the right to vote. The King Amanullah actually gave women the right to vote in the 1920s, which is, just another sign of the advanced thinking that this nation really was really moving towards on its own. And it was getting no support, needless to say, from the British Empire, who actually viewed any kind of show of a moderate Islamic state as against the interests of the British Empire because it would inspire other Islamic states.
One of the things that, I was going to say, one of the things that you talk about in your book, we hear a great deal in recent years about moderate Islam, pro and con, the need for it, the absence of it, what have you. One of the things that you point out in the book is that, in fact, Afghanistan was, and for a long time had been, a major epicenter of a truly moderate and tolerant Islam, and that manifestation has basically been deliberate, I wouldn't say sacrificed, but has been annihilated as a deliberate policy goal of the decades-long concatenation that we've been hammering together here.
Well, that's actually really it. Once again, what we're saying is the United States literally has taken British policy and attitude towards Afghanistan and simply continued it. And that would be a very good example that instead of supporting the moderates that were, in fact, when we went to Afghanistan in 1981, they referred to their form of Islam as progressive Islam, and they felt that the form that was fighting against them, they called American Islam because it was being financed by the United States, the insurgency against them.
Well, if you look at the Cold War, Dave, you'll see that there's the same kind of dynamic, that we've got conservatives and liberals in the West, and you had conservatives and liberals actually within the Soviet Union. I think we probably mentioned in a previous interview with you where when we spoke with Paul Warnke, who had negotiated the SALT II treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets, he said that he had been to the Soviet Union with Robert McNamara in the 1960s, when this would have been the beginnings of détente. The war wasn't going badly. They knew they had to reestablish some kind of relationship with the Soviet Union so that it wouldn't get out of control, and so that the Soviets wouldn't retaliate against the United States for the bombings and the things that were going on in Vietnam. And so the Soviets, they were approached by a lot of mid-level bureaucrats who were in the Soviet system at the time. And those mid-level bureaucrats said, we know you've got a problem with your hawks in the United States and your military-industrial complex. Well, we've got the same problem here. We want to open up a relationship with the United States. We know that we've only got, another couple of decades to go in terms of our economy. We can't keep this country and this system going for much longer. But how do we get out from under it? But you see, what happened is that, and that's why what happened in 1979 and 1980 was such a tragedy, was that the hawks in both systems, in both the American system and the Soviet system, managed to perpetuate this kind of competition over the guys who wanted to negotiate a way out of the situation on both sides of the deal. And so you had another 10 years in which the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the hawks in the United States during the Ronald Reagan's administration were pretending that they were being aggressive, when actually what they were doing was being defensive. The reason why they went into the Soviet Union, of course, was because they were horribly defensive over their southern border. That was their so-called the underbelly of the Soviet Empire. And so as a result of that, they were very conscious of that, and so were the people in Washington conscious of that, which was, of course, the reason why they did it.
Well, considering, I think, Halford Mackinder's idea of controlling Eurasia, yes, the Soviets and the Russians did have a legitimate concern about their southern border. There was no question about that.
So the question comes down to, for us, in our generation, at this particular time, it's a very similar time to the way it was in 1979. The issues are very much the same. They're taking place, the politics, the international politics are taking place in the same part of the world. But are we going to go about with the same kind of game that we played in 1979? It would appear that there are influences within the Obama administration, guys like Joe Biden and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's got the president's ear, are definitely influencing him towards resuming this kind of anti-Russian, now with an anti-Russian agenda as opposed to an anti-Soviet agenda, and then siding along with, they're calling it the Special G2, with the group of two, the United States as the consumers and China as the producers. And we've got this special relationship with China. And, there's a lot of people Neil Ferguson has got a lot of opinions about this, the historical economist. And the economic, I guess he's an economic historian is what you'd refer to him as. And he's got a lot of, he coined the phrase Chimerica, and he's got a lot of opinions about the fact that Chinese really don't need us in 2009 the way they needed us in 1979. They really are in a position to kind of make their own deals with Moscow. And that, this is a very, very slippery slope that the United States is pursuing on to continue this old, almost 19th century British policy of divide and rule and making friends with this guy and pushing the other guy out and pushing the Russian out of the picture. We really need a new way of looking at this whole situation and some new thinking here.
Time permitting, perhaps not in this interview, but maybe certainly in our next talk, I'd like to read a quote from the Financial Times in which an observer in no uncertain terms compared this country at this point in time to the latter stages of the Roman Empire and feared a similar type of collapse.
There's no question that the indications are that it seems to be a symptom of empire. Maybe that's the point. The idea of empire is overstretch. That's really what it means. And you reach a point where you're so huge you don't even know that you're destroying yourself.
I mean, at this point, we are certainly behaving an awful lot like the British Empire. We are very overextended in terms of our commitments. We can't pick up. I mean, we live in a nice town here north of Boston, where we're talking to you from right now, and this town has been in survival mode for the last couple of years. I mean, this is a town that shouldn't be anywhere close to survival mode. But, in terms of the number of kids, everything has become a fee. Bus service has become a fee. Everything is reaching the point where nothing can be afforded any longer. And yet, here we are dealing with a defense budget that's reached over $1 trillion. We're fighting two wars simultaneously. And being encouraged to invest even more and more money into a non-productive economy when the existing economy is essentially bankrupt. I mean, I think the best indication of how successful any economy is in the world right now and how flexible they are is our automobile industry. And the fact is that our automobile industry is on the rocks, while the Japanese and the Germans and the French and the other European nations and Korea are able to sustain an automobile industry. And so they may not be as healthy as they could have been under normal circumstances, but they're not in bankruptcy. So, we've really got to sit back. We've been living, I think we probably stated this before, but I'll state it again because I think it's important. We've been living in this mentality of warfare since Pearl Harbor in 1941. I like to say that my father was in World War II. He was gone for 2 years in Europe. My Liz's father welded Liberty ships in Brooklyn Harbor. We grew up with this. It was always a part. We grew up in the Cold War. Both my brothers were called up for the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, this was something that was very much an aspect of our understanding, of our belief. And when we got to be of the right age, we looked at this and said, wait a minute, what is causing this? Why has this happened again? And this was 30 years ago.
And I also think that for a lot of people, it was also when the Soviet Union finally dissolved, it was simply a matter of, where's the big benefit here? And the fact that we literally witnessed a morphing into the next war. And we could see that there are certain lines of people that seem to automatically shift to the next war. And so, you begin to realize there's a pattern here, and you have to begin to question the pattern and look at it. And once you pull yourself out of sort of the mindless sort of just going along, you literally begin to recognize this pattern has been repeating itself over and over and over again. Now, I really liken it at this point. I think we're almost at, a metaphoric stage. The end of The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy arrives with the witch's broom and she finally confronts the wizard and she realizes that the wizard really doesn't have any power at all. And at the very end when she says, "You're a bad man," and the wizard looks at her and says, "No, I'm a good man. I'm a bad wizard." And I really think at some level we're dealing with the same crisis. We have leaders, when they put on the mantle of president, vice president, the secretary of defense, something happens to them. something happens. They lose their humanity. They lose their connection to what the whole meaning of this is about. And that seems to be that this thing called empire seems to be that expression of it, when it's gone as far as it can go and it simply just ends. Their ability to keep going just ends. It's as if the dream is over.
I'd like to read that passage. I found the passage I had in mind, Elizabeth and Paul, on page 325, and I'd like to save most of your prescriptions for President Obama and U.S. policy and what you call the 21st chapter for another interview. But sort of assessing the burning deck, on page 325, you write, if President Obama is to save Afghanistan and the United States itself from the impending tipping point, it would be wise to follow the advice of David Walker, Comptroller General of the United States. Warning that the United States government was paralleling the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Walker described the country in an August 2007 interview with the Financial Times as being on a burning platform, unquote, of unsustainable policies and practices with fiscal deficits, chronic health care underfunding, immigration and overseas commitments threatening a crisis if action is not taken soon. I think that when in the next interview that we do, I think listeners are not only going to be interested by some of your specific prescriptions for the Obama administration and U.S. Policy, I think they're going to be surprised. I think anyone listening to the interviews to date would be surprised that you didn't call for an outright withdrawal. But I'd like to titillate the listeners with that thought and come back to that in the future. We've talked about Afghan designs and how the heroin trade was inextricably linked with with the Pakistani designs, and how the heroin trade was linked with that, going all the way back to the pre-Soviet invasion throughout that covert operation and on through the present. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I'd like to talk about how some of these dynamics play into aspects of September 11th, specifically. And you write briefly on page 244, in April of 2001, Massoud addressed the European Parliament and warned that Al-Qaeda was planning an important terrorist attack. Well, now, gosh, that's April of 2001. I wonder, I guess, what was George Bush doing beside clearing brush nobody evidenced a whole lot of interest in that one. But you talk about September 11th and how Pakistani intelligence officials were making some very interesting payoffs at some very interesting times, and observations by people like Sibel Edmonds. Tell us a little bit about how some of these dynamics specifically play into aspects of the September 11th investigation.
Well, we were, communing with the exile Afghan community that was here in the United States in the late 1990s, and there was clearly a desire and an interest on their part to get rid of the Taliban. The Taliban certainly were not what the Afghan exile population wanted to do. We went down to Washington at one point. We went to a number of different, Congress people and talked to them, and what was alarming to us was that the people who understood what was going on in Afghanistan and wanted the U.S. government to do something to stop the Taliban's excesses were some very, very conservative Republican congressmen, or had been conservative Republican congressmen. Unfortunately, when we talked to Democratic congressmen about what the story was, they said, "Oh, Charlie Wilson handles Afghanistan for us." Well, as we know now, of course, Charlie Wilson was a lobbyist for Pakistan. And so what happens is that when you get into looking up to the run-up of 9/11 and the complexities of this situation, you've got a lot of specific little interests going on. You've got America's relationship with Pakistanis, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, which is their version of our CIA. You've got this off-the-books drugs for guns operation, which is still going on. You have the entire oil industry moving from the Middle East up into South Central Asia. And you've got the Texas oil boys together with the Saudi oil boys and the United Arab Emirates oil boys, and some cultural institutions back and forth, that are supportive of this kind of cultural relationship and a better understanding of Arab culture, of Wahhabi culture, essentially. And they're advocating for moving the Wahhabist strain. I mean, one of the things we came across, I think it was a citation from Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed Rashid is the Pakistani journalist who's written a couple of very bestsellers about the situation, and he was talking with an American official, and the American official at the time had said, So what if the Taliban establish a kind of Saudi Arabian type of structure in Afghanistan? They'll have oil, they'll have pipelines, and they'll have guys with turbans running around running the country. What's wrong with that? I mean, that was pretty much the attitude that we were getting in 1988, 1999, which of course completely obliterated this kind of effort, any effort whatsoever to modernize Afghanistan, to bring Afghanistan into a kind of unity with the West in terms of its ideas. What the West was doing, what the United States specifically was doing, was casting Afghanistan off to this extremist form of radical Islam and saying as long as it serves as long as they let us put pipelines through there, we don't really care what happens to the Afghan people.
And that is pretty much why when the Taliban took over, starting, I think, in 1994, by 96, when they had taken over, the entire agenda really had fulfilled Pakistan's dream of having a Pakistani-friendly government in Afghanistan, but that also was fulfilling the dreams of the pipeline. In fact, during the Clinton administration, there was tremendous effort to try to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government so that the UNICAL deal could go through. And the only reason that it wasn't recognized was because of the effort of the feminist majority to bring attention to what was referred to as gender apartheid against the Afghan women. And so these are the kinds of things that really, were all playing a part of it. And the fact that Afghanistan was actually being used as the base for Al-Qaeda, at some level you just begin to wonder how the immense force of the United States and all these intelligence agencies didn't have any understanding of that at all.
I think Liz hit on the key word here, the United States, and that's just it. I think that's a misnomer when it comes to Afghanistan. We think of our country being represented by our military and by our foreign policy in that part of the world, but what's happened over the last 25 or 30 years is a massive a change in that representation, and specifically during the Clinton years, from 92 until 1980, that part of the world was very much commercialized. The State Department was acting overtly on behalf of the pipeline companies and the pipeline consortiums, and a lot of the people who had been involved in the politics of Afghanistan, the conservative politics of Afghanistan, guys like Zalmay Khalilzad and some of the other people who had signed on as consultants to the UNICAL pipeline deal, these were the people the Oakleys as an example. Phyllis Oakley was at the State Department. Robert Oakley was the U.S. ambassador. All of these people signed on as representatives and lobbyists for UNICAL pipeline. So suddenly you've got what should have been American foreign policy being conducted on behalf and the benefit of the United States of America, suddenly just rolling over into this very specific commercialized self-interest of a lot of oil companies in certain parts of the United States and in the Middle East. And so as a result of that, when 9/11 occurred, you had all of these private deals that had been going on. As you mentioned, we say in the book about the head of Pakistan's ISI wiring money to Muhammad Atta, and you have these existing pipelines for revenue that were established during the days of the Mujahideen in the 1990s through the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And so you've got a lot of these old residual pipelines that are still in effect, with a lot of these training facilities in the United States that are still operating without anybody really having any reason to look at them. And that's just it. You see, it became so lax and so privatized that the ordinary functions of government that you think should have been involved with looking at these people simply weren't doing it anymore.
Very good. So to find out more about the things we've been talking about, do check out the book. We've been speaking with Elizebeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just out, published in softcover by City Lights Books. And can't recommend the book strongly enough. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record 683, being recorded on August 2nd of 2009. For Paul and Elizabeth, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening.